Welcome back, boxing fans, to another great show with Sean on Boxing. Today, we're going to be talking about the greatest middleweight of all time, Gennady Golovkin. Stay tuned to that and more with Sean on Boxing. I will see you in a minute. Welcome back. So today, I'm going to be discussing Gennady Golovkin, the yeses and the nos, the goods and the bads, the career of this man who really sort of took boxing um, by surprise. He was a guy that obviously won a silver medal in the Olympics, didn't get a lot of attention, ended up signing with a German promoter, was kind of isolated over in Germany. Obviously, being a European, he sort of stayed home and stayed where he felt he'd be more comfortable. And because of that, ended up costing himself time and money and opportunities, only to then find out that he needed to move to America. Eventually did that, and a star was born. Did everything always work out perfectly during his career? Of course not. A lot of opportunities slipped through his fingers. A lot of victories that potentially he should have had didn't work out the way we expected. But still, nonetheless, this two-time unified middleweight champion had what can only be described as a great career. It's up to boxing pundits and historians to determine where Gennady Golovkin rates on the all-time middleweight list. And obviously, there's going to be some people that have him very high, some people that aren't really sold on him, some people that are just haters and try to diminish him. But yet, Gennady Golovkin, even after basically being retired from the sport, is still making a huge impact in the sporting world. Obviously, in this past Olympics in France, he was the sports commissioner, sports governor, sports controller for Kazakhstan, and obviously was supporting Kazakhstan's performances in this year's Olympics, and is one of the big pundits globally pushing for boxing to remain part of the Olympics. And so hopefully Gennady Golovkin is going to be able to get enough support to make that happen. Because for me, boxing out of the Olympics would be a true tragedy, And I can't imagine that that would be what happened. But the way the boxing was done in this past Olympics, you can understand how it might be fallen off. The biggest conversation around boxing during this Paris Olympics was transgendered females fighting males fighting as females. This had more attention than anything. Yet the majority of boxing fans didn't give a shit, weren't interested, and weren't even watching those women fight, right? And unfortunately, at the same time, you literally had 5 Uzbekistanians end up becoming gold medalists out of 7 weight classes. 5 people from one country winning gold medals in 7 weight classes. I mean, it's the only time I think in Olympic boxing history that's ever been done. But unfortunately, a lot of those people were looked past because of this woke agenda that obviously continues to get pushed towards sports. Hopefully, Golovkin now, as a representation, a rep for boxing, is going to be able to get it to be still part of the upcoming Olympics in the future. But we will wait and see. But let's get to it. Obviously, this isn't so much about that aspect. It's obviously about that and more. So here we go. Gennady Golovkin, 42, 2-1, 37 KOs. One of his great accomplishments was having the highest knockout percentage in history of middleweight champions. And that's in a middleweight division stacked full of legendary middleweight fighters like Hagler, Monzon, Sugar Ray Robinson, and many others. But the guy who had the highest knockout percentage was Gennady Golovkin, who retired, or at this point of his career, now stands at 88% KO ratio. At 5'10 and a half with a 70-inch reach, he had very good measurements for the middleweight division. Not very long or very tall, but solid measurements for that division. Was able to carry that weight throughout his whole career and remained a middleweight for the majority of his career, outside, of course, of that one Canelo Alvarez fight at 168. Some people use this as a way to criticize and belittle him, but ironically enough, there's been many great middleweights in history who primarily spent all their career at that weight class. Marvin Hagler, the perfect example, a man who only fought at 160 pounds, could have moved up to 175 and took on Michael Spinks, which at the time would have been a historical fight, but chose to remain at 160 and wait for lightweights and welterweights to move up to his weight division. Guys like Duran, Hearns, and Sugar Ray Leonard, which in hindsight was the right thing to do, right? We also saw Bernard Hopkins do the same thing. He also remained at this division, waiting for smaller fighters to move into the division. Tito Trinidad, Oscar De La Hoya. He did end up moving up to 175 later on in his career, because this was a man that started his career at 175, moved down in the weight class to 160, where, like majority of fighters today, he would be able to have some size advantage to the opponents he was facing. Don't take that as a negative or a criticism to B-Hop, because literally you see this happen in every single weight division in boxing today. So he didn't do anything that everybody else doesn't do. Golovkin, one of the few that didn't do that. Guys like Pacquiao and guys like Floyd Mayweather, also guys who remained small for their weight divisions, like Lomachenko. So there's always the odd fighter who fights below, as opposed to guys that really sort of drain themselves to get that advantage, who potentially could easily be fighting well above their normal weight division. Golovkin was one of those who was a career 160-pound fighter, obviously out of Kazakhstan. Obviously has homes throughout the States. His kids were educated in America. So he is, I think, a dual citizenship, if I'm not incorrect. But let's take a quick peek of his career to begin with. We're going to quickly peek at his amateur pedigree, which obviously needs to be looked at as a little bit. According to BoxRec, and obviously they don't list the whole amateur resume that fighters have. Mostly it's just big tournaments that are easily to document. So on BoxRec, his record is listed at 44, 8, and 11. One of the great things we can say about Gennady Golovkin was his chin. One of the best chins in boxing history, in middleweight boxing history. Never dropped as an amateur or a pro. And obviously a guy that's been in with tons of super talent. We go through and we see fighters that he's faced as amateurs. We're just trying to see guys that went on to do great things, like Andre Dirrell, a guy who went on to become a 168-pound fighter. He faced him in 2004, beat him on points. Great Cuban fighter, Yordenis Desperanus, ended up beating him on points. Oleg Maskin, people might remember him as the guy that went on to be a heavyweight, beat him. Yordenis Desperanus, the Cuban, ended up beating him. Lucien Bute ended up stopping him. Andy Lee ended up beating him. Matt Korbarov ended up beating him. Andre Dirrell, the second time around, ended up losing. We skimmed through. Daniel Giel, middleweight champion 2 times, beat him in the East Asian Games. So there we go. You can see in the fights listed that he was in with world champions. Obviously, guys like Daniel Giel went on to become a world champion. Obviously, my man Andre Dirrell went on to become a world champion. Matt Korbarov, I'm not sure if he ever became a champion, but obviously was a champion contender. Andy Lee went on to become a champion. Lucien Bute went on to become a champion. Obviously, Desperanus was a Cuban, so the same opportunities weren't allowed for him. So, in the short-listed career here of fighters that Gennady Golovkin did fight in the amateurs, there was 4 world champions that he ended up facing, which is pretty impressive. Then we go into his pro career. It's necessary to remember that this is a man who signed with a German promoter, the same promoter who promoted Felix Sturm. This is one reason why Gennady Golovkin was the WBA regular champion for such an extended period of time, because putting himself in position to get that world title fight with his stablemate, Felix Sturm, who was the WBA champion for an extended period of time, was refused to him, which is why he ended up leaving his German promoter, fighting throughout Central America, and eventually moving to America, where Andy Lee, Daniel Geale, Billy Joe Saunders, Sergio Martinez, Cotto, Canelo Alvarez, Peter Quillin, and quite a few other world champions. Dmitry Pirog, obviously that was supposed to be his American debut, but Dmitry Pirog, the same man who beat Danny Jacobs, ended up getting a back injury during training for that fight and retired from boxing. So that's 9 world champions that, because of injuries or blatantly ducking, fell through. And those fights, obviously, Golovkin was never allowed to get. So many people that are haters of him consistently talk about fighters at 154. Even if he beat them, he would have been criticized for fighting smaller fighters being pulled up in weight. Then he gets criticized because he didn't fight Andre Ward, a fighter who literally was inactive and had just been inactive for 2 years. So if you would have beat him, they would have said you beat a guy that was basically out of the ring for 2 years, right? There would have been no benefit from fighting an Andre Ward at that time. He wasn't a big seller. He'd been inactive. He wasn't a big name in American boxing. Let's just be honest. He did 2 pay-per-views with Kovalev. Neither of those pay-per-views did very well at all on HBO pay-per-view. So here's his early career, fighting middling, mediocre type of fighters for 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 fights of his career, until finally stepping up and facing a legitimate fighter in Kamitsky, who was 19-3-1 at the time, stopping him. Ended up facing Bodala, 11-1, and then South African fighter Masego, 15-8, Ian Gardner, 20-3, a less than stellar opponent, Ibrahim Seed, 9-4-2, Amar Amari, 13-9-1, and then Malik Cesara, 29-3, Javier Alberto Miama, 35-7-1, Anthony Greenridge, 13-2-1, John Anderson Cavallo, 19-3-1, and Mikhail Makava, 10-0. And then, of course, the first world champion level fighter he faced in 2010, Milton Nunez. At this time, obviously, he'd been a pro for 4 years, becoming pro in 2006, fighting quite a bit, 2007, 3 times, 2008, 5 times, and 2009, obviously 3 times before, or 4 times before 2010, his 4th year as a pro, stepping in to face a fighter in Milton Nunez who was 21-1. Ended up stopping him in 1 round. Then faced Nilson Julio Tapia and stopped him in 3 rounds. At this point, he was getting that not elite level middleweight, but very solid world contender type of fighters, solid resumes, guys that were at good parts of their career. Let's just take a look at McAuliffe, obviously 10-0, ended up 11-1, Russian fighter, obviously had 1 more fight after Golovkin and then retired, right? You think about Milton Nunez, his resume at the end of his career, not so good, 40, 33-1. So in hindsight, you can look at that and be critical of it. But most of that, all of it came after Golovkin, right? Prior to Golovkin, he'd lost 1 fight to Julio Tapia, who obviously Golovkin had already fought. Went on to face Seguio Herrera, a draw, seeing the fighters he's faced. Not world champions or great fighters. Unfortunately, when you fight a lot of foreign fighters, this is what happens. They end up having resumes that look good, but when you look at the quality of opposition they're facing, we see this with Thai fighters all the time. Guys that are 50-1 and fighting world champions, yet when you look at their resumes, mediocre. Fought Golovkin, who was at this time 18-0, stopped him in 1 round, ended up facing, other fighters and just becoming a stepping stone. Korbarov, obviously, who went on to become a world contender. We saw him fight Charlo. Many people feel he beat Charlo. Went 8 rounds with Korbarov. Got stopped by 1 round by Chudanov. Fought Sergio Mora, went 8 rounds with him. Danny Jacobs stopped him in 1 round. Milky Kampfor 3 rounds. So, obviously not one of the best middleweights in boxing history, but at this time, building up, obviously his German promoter not wanting to put him in the big fights with the big name guys in and around the middleweight division at that time. People will be critical of Golovkin, but yet you can look at the majority of fighters today and their resumes are similar. Then, of course, he faced ex-world champion, the first champion of his career, Kasim Uma, who went 10 rounds in what was a great fight. If you haven't seen that fight, go check it out. It is easily, by and far, the first real legitimate test that Golovkin had in his career. Uma, who was a 154-pound world champion, had a lot of recognition as being one of the child soldiers in Africa during, I can't remember what country he comes from and what the conflict was, but you can do your research. Very good fight. Kasim Uma, a tough motherfucker, gave Golovkin a very good fight. Then faced LeJohn Simpson, 23-3-2, stopped him 1 round. A very tall, long fighter, not a bum at all. Philadelphia fighter. Obviously, only ended up losing 5 fights, only stopped twice in his career. Once of those times, obviously, to Golovkin. Ended up losing to Jillian Love 2 years after losing to Golovkin. Prior to that, Sebastian Sylvester, another world champion who he fought for the IBF title, right, went 12 rounds with him. The Sylvester that actually ducked Golovkin as well. Arthur Abraham, a world champion, went 12 rounds with him. These are 2 world champions. He lost those 2 fights for IBF middleweight titles, but ended up going the distance with both of those fighters, right? Whereas Golovkin destroyed him in 1 round. Fought Darnell Boone, had a draw to Darnell Boone. Those people that know, Darnell Boone, one of the hardest punchers in boxing. After that, he faced tough Japanese fighter Fujiyama, 19-3. At this point, he was an IBO champion. He'd won versus Simon, defended it versus Fujiyama, and at this time made his American debut in 2012. So this was 6 years after becoming a pro, 6 years of being in contract with his German promoter, finally able to get free and come over to America for his first fight, facing Gregor Proska, who at the time was 28-1. At this time, people who really followed boxing were aware of who Golovkin was. They knew he was a real contender. We heard stories about how he was chasing after Sturm and Sylvester and those other champions at the time were blatantly ducking him. We saw the great knockout power. We saw some of the highlight reel knockouts he had. If you're really a hardcore fan, you saw the Kasuma Uma fight, and at that point, you were really sold on his excitement. And then, of course, making his American debut against Proska, this fight started to get a lot of attention. Proska obviously was a replacement opponent for Dmitry Pirog. Proska, a similar styled European fighter, slick, awkward, not orthodox, straight up European type of fighter, right? A little more American in the way he fought, hands down, footwork, angles. So he was a good replacement opponent for Pirog because he had a similar style, but obviously wasn't as good as Pirog. 29-4, 21 knockouts, tough Polish fighter. Obviously, prior to Golovkin, he was coming off of a win over Kerry Hope for the European middleweight title. Had lost to Hope and beat Hope, had previously beaten ex-middleweight champion Sebastian Sylvester. So was in with a world title champion, stopped him in 3 rounds, ended up winning the European title versus Kerry Hope. Obviously, majority decision, coming back, stopping him in the rematch. At this point, he was getting quite a bit of push, right? And was seen as a potential real opponent. Then, of course, jumped in with Golovkin, got stopped in 5 rounds, Golovkin making his debut. Ended up afterwards facing Sergio Mora, ex-world champion, went the distance with Mora. Obviously, never a hard puncher, so it's understandable. But if you look at the scorecards, competitive. Then he faced Selecki later on in his career. Selecki at the time, undefeated fighter, ended up stopping him in 7 rounds. We know Selecki went on to be a very good contender. Obviously, just got dismantled recently in a fight. Then after that, he faced Gabriel Rosado. Gabriel Rosado, obviously, we've seen what Gabriel Rosado has been able to do in his career. People want to discredit and downplay, but this was literally Golovkin's second fight in America. Was an IBO world champion, right? And a WBA regular champion at this time. You notice that title's not listed. Maybe that's because BoxRec now is at war with the WBA. I think that's who they're at war with. So those titles are no longer listed. Stopped him. And let's look at Rosado just to take some perspective. Obviously, this is what his resume is now. When he faced Golovkin all the way back in this day, Golovkin was 24-0. Obviously, he was a good fighter who, at that point, had lost to Derek Ennis and Alfredo Angulo, stopped in 2 rounds by Angulo. Fernando Guerrera, who was a really hot prospect, went the distance with him. Lost to a tough Nigerian fighter, lost to Chris Gray. So he had some losses in his resume, but was a very highly ranked 154-pound fighter, beat Kasim Uma, by split decision, beat Saul Roman, obviously then, beat Jesus Soto Carras, which in hindsight is a very, very good win. Secha Powell, a solid fighter, and then faced Golovkin, who destroyed him in 7 rounds, making a huge statement. Went on to face Javlian Love, got beat by Peter Quillen, another champion who ducked Golovkin, fought Charlo, went the distance with Charlo, faced Lemieux, got stopped in 10 rounds by him, faced Joshua Clottey, Clottey, a very good fighter, beat him, went on and lost to Willie Monroe, 12-round decision, lost to Martin Murray, majority decision, beat Glenn Tapia, stopped him in 6, had a draw with Luis Aries, very good fighter, lost to Selecki, lost to Daniel Jacobs by split decision, knocked out Bekmel Kuziev not that long ago, went the distance with Jaime Munguia back in 2021, lost a majority decision to Shane Mosley, lost to Ali Akhmedov, and then lost to Bekmel Kuziev in the rematch, going the distance in all those fighters. And this is literally fighting at 168 pounds. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, maybe more. But those 6 fights, all 168 pounds. Oh, this one also 168. So 7 fights at 168 pounds. But people wanted to discredit Golovkin, saying he pulled him up. But this is a fighter who went on to campaign at 168 pounds, far more than Golovkin did. Then staying busy, trying to build up his name, which is something that they did a good job in. Obviously fought 4 times in 2013 against solid opposition. When you can't get the best, you make sure you stay busy and you fight the rest and make sure you win impressively. Stopping Rosado in 7, beating Ishida, a fighter who'd never been stopped, ended up fighting at heavyweight later on in his career in 3 rounds in a sensational knockout, faced Matthew Macklin, a guy that was a solid top 10 fighter. Stopped him in 3 rounds with an incredible shot, and then faced Curtis Stevenson. Curtis Stevenson, who is a monster puncher, a guy that literally people were saying was going to beat Golovkin. Now, in hindsight, people want to dismiss that and ignore it, but that was how early the hate started to gravitate towards Golovkin. Literally, how early. He'd made 1, 2, 3, 4 professional fights in America. 4. And already at this point, he was starting to catch hate. So when he fought Curtis Stevenson, people were literally pushing Curtis Stevenson as the guy that was going to beat him. Stopped him in 8 rounds, sensational knockout. Obviously, the great picture of Curtis Stevenson with his great expression after getting dropped. Faced tough fighter Adama, Obviously, this fight also happened in Monte Carlo. He went to Monte Carlo twice, once for Ishida, once for Adama, obviously getting paid good money to fight in Europe, but also to stay busy, trying to build up his name, staying active and busy, trying to get the big fights at the middleweight division. Stopped him in 7 rounds, and then faced Daniel Geale. Interesting enough, Daniel Geale had previously been a world champion, right? And Golovkin and his team were trying to get that unification fight with Daniel Geale, right? Let's go back and see specifically where that was. So this was Daniel Geale, who had beat Sylvester, ex-world champion, right? IBF middleweight champion, beat him after beating Kamaruzian to become the mandatory, beat the champion, Sylvester, who blatantly ducked Golovkin, defended his title against this guy, who I'm unfamiliar with, faced Adama, beat Adama, and then faced ex-world champion Felix Sturm, another middleweight champion who blatantly ducked Golovkin for a million years. Then faced Anthony Mundine in a great Australia versus Australia fight, defending his IBF title against Mundine, another champion, right? And then obviously faced Darren Barker, who was a top contender. But instead of facing Darren Barker at this time, Golovkin and his team were trying to get a unification fight for obviously Darren Barker and Golovkin. Sorry, for Daniel Geale and Golovkin, another world champion who blatantly ducked Golovkin, right? People love to criticize and hate on Golovkin's resume, but right now I've just listed Sylvester, right? 1, Sturm, 2, Mundine, 3, and Daniel Geale, 4 middleweight world champions at this time who blatantly had ducked Golovkin, all to fight a British fighter who was 25-1 in Darren Barker. Why? Because after beating guys like Adama, Felix Sturm, Anthony Mundine, it just went to be expected that he was going to beat Darren Barker in his title defense. Ended up losing a split decision. I thought a controversial fight that Daniel Geale deserved to win, but this is what happens. You walk away from a Golovkin unification fight to take on an unknown fighter in Barker. You lose to him. Then you face Gareth Wood in a bounce back fight. Then finally, you jump at the opportunity to face Golovkin, right? But this is after you blatantly ducked the fight with Golovkin, and Golovkin knocks you out in 3 rounds. And this is Daniel Geale, that was a 2-time middleweight world champion, who went on to then beat Jared Fletcher, ended up facing Melgo Cotto, who ended up having him fight at a catchweight, draining him down from 160 to 154, right? Only for his next fight to be against another Australian fighter in Renio Quinlan at 168 pounds, showing you how much he was drained in that fight against Cotto. So, right, at this point, you'd have to say Daniel Geale is probably the most highly ranked fighter that Golovkin had faced in his career. A guy who'd been a 2-time IBF champion, had beaten world champions like Sylvester and Sturm and Mundine, right? 3 world champions he'd beaten, right? People, of course, want to downplay Golovkin and dismiss Geale. And even if Geale and Golovkin had fought for unification, they still would have downplayed him, because literally at this point, he was getting so much hate and criticism. And all he was trying to do was face Sergio Martinez and Peter Quillen, who said he needed $10 million to face Golovkin, and Sergio Martinez, who blatantly ducked him to go face Miguel Cotto. Then after that, he faced Marco Antonio Rubio. He obviously stopped in 2 rounds. This was for the WBC interim title, defending his IBO title and his WBA regular title. Rubio, not a joke, right? If we scroll back, we can see what kind of impact, what kind of fighters Rubio had fought early in his career. Had already beaten Kasim Uma back in 2006 when Golovkin made his debut. This was for a 154-pound title eliminator, beat him by split decision. Ended up facing this tough Ukrainian fighter to win the WBC international title, ended up losing to him, right? Then went on to face Kelly Pavlik for the WBC and WBO middleweight title. Got stopped in 9 rounds by Kelly Pavlik. Kelly Pavlik, who in 2009 was a superstar. And what people failed to discuss is the fact that Golovkin tried to get a Kelly Pavlik fight as well. And Kelly Pavlik's team and Golovkin's German promoter stopped that fight from happening, right? So I can understand why Kelly Pavlik would duck that fight, because how much credit are you going to get for fighting some unknown Kazakhstanian knockout puncher? Not that much. Then he ended up going on, facing more great fighters in his career, faced David Lemieux, who was one of the hottest up-and-coming young fighters in boxing, 25-0 as a Canadian. We all knew David Lemieux. He was a fucking wrecking machine. He ended up stopping Lemieux in 7 rounds. Lemieux gassed out because he wasn't able to knock him out. Then went on to face more fighters, faced Julio Cesar Chavez for the WBC middleweight title. Went the distance with him. Faced Jorge Cota, beat him to become the IBF International Middleweight Vacant Champion, right? Then faced Carlos Baldemir, stopped him in 4 rounds to defend his title. Boom, 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 boom. Then faced Golovkin, who stopped him in 2 rounds. After that, he ended up moving up in weight from 160 to 169, facing Anthony Durrell. Went the distance with Anthony Durrell. Anthony Durrell was a great fighter, but yet moving up a whole other weight division, Anthony Durrell was not able to be as dominating and destructive as Gennady Golovkin had been at 160 pounds, stopping him in 2 rounds, right? But once again, another fighter who had never been knocked out, who Golovkin got no credit for at all. Then he faced Martin Murray. Martin Murray, he also faced in Monte Carlo. Martin Murray had a criminal record, so he wasn't able to come over to the States. This is why Golovkin had his 3rd fight overseas, as well as the fact that those fights were paying him well, so they might as well continue to go fight in Monte Carlo, which is a huge casino area as well. Martin Murray is a guy who is very underrated, super underrated. We go back in his career, and you can see right here, a guy that fought Felix Sturm, right, after beating Nick Blackwell. He beat Nick Blackwell and then ended up earning a fight with Felix Sturm. Ended up getting robbed in Germany by split decision. Faced Karim Archer, a guy that went on to beat David Lemieux, Jorge Navarro, and then faced Sergio Martinez in Argentina. Ended up getting robbed in Argentina, right, for the WBC middleweight title. Robbed. If you saw that fight, you know blatantly there was a robbery. Martinez was dropped multiple times. Neither of those droppages were counted. Whereas, of course, you know, one of them was the one in the 8th, but 2 others weren't. Then he faced Kamitsky, a tough fighter, Taya, and then Martin Bursak, also a very good fighter as well, Sparta, and then faced Golovkin, who stopped him in 11 rounds, right? And that is a testament to what a good fighter Martin Murray was, that he was able to go 11 rounds with Golovkin in what was a very good performance. Golovkin's jab was stellar in that fight. Ended up facing Arthur Abraham at 168 pounds for the WBO world title afterwards. Ended up losing split decision once again. So didn't get knocked out by Arthur Abraham at 168. Didn't get fucking destroyed by middleweight champion Sergio Martinez. Didn't get destroyed by middleweight world champion Felix Sturm, but ended up fucking getting knocked out by Golovkin, right? Then ended up facing George Groves at 168 pounds. Went the distance, losing to George Groves. Obviously, at this time, it was much later in his career, but still a fantastic performance against a guy that obviously went on to become a very good world champion at 168 pounds. Faced Noelia Lawal, who was undefeated at this time, beat him. Then faced Gabriel Rosado, beat him, right? Roberto Garcia beat him. Faced Endam, ended up losing a majority decision to him for the WBC silver title. right? Then faced, obviously, Billy Joe Saunders in his last fight, 168-pound fight for Billy Joe Saunders, WBO title, losing a unanimous decision to Billy Joe Saunders. So when you think about Martin Murray, very, very good opponent, but a guy that, of course, Golovkin gets no credit for beating. Murray, Rubio, Gill, Curtis Stevenson, Macklin, Rosado. At this point, Golovkin was starting to get a good little resume together. Proxa, right? Kasim Uma. 8 really good, legitimate fighters. Even Lejeune Simon, when he faced him, it was a very good opponent at that time, right? Very solid. Anybody else that would have fought a guy like Lejeune Simon for an IBF world title at that time would get full credit for it. Of course, Golovkin at this point was getting tons of hate. At this time, what everybody was saying, the haters, is that he was ducking Andrade, Charlo, and Lara at 154 pounds. Yet these 4 world champions never fought each other. Literally, you had 2 Charlos, an Andrade, and a Lara, all at 154 pounds. 3 of them were PBC fighters. The other one obviously was kind of a nomad, shot himself in the foot walking away from a unification fight with one of the Charlos, and then sort of ended up having nothing really happen with his career ever. Until, of course, he went back to work with the PBC against David Benavidez, ironically enough. But these guys never fought one another because they were all afraid of Lara. So they blatantly all ducked Erislandy Lara, right? And then the talk was that Golovkin was ducking them. But how is Golovkin ducking 154-pound world champions when literally what he was doing was chasing the champions at middleweight? At this time, Andy Lee, Sergio Martinez, Miguel Cotto, Canelo Alvarez, Peter Quillen, right? Those were the champions here, the second generation of middleweight champions. We already talked about the first generation of middleweight champions who had blatantly ducked him prior, right, to him really making his big stance at the middleweight division in America. After that, he ended up facing Willie Monroe. Willie Monroe at the time, 19-1. Right? Willie Monroe was seen as one of those slick American fighters that he was afraid of. A guy that had a 4-inch reach advantage, right? 24-3, only stopped once in his career by Golovkin. Not much of a power puncher, but then neither was Lara, one of the Charlos, or Andrade back at 154 pounds. This was a guy who, prior to facing Golovkin, had lost to Darnell Boone by split decision. We know Darnell Boone, hard puncher. Moved up his weight, fought a good fighter in Kopalenko, nice guy. I had talked to him on social media a lot. Beat him, beat Brandon Adams, who at the time was 14-0 for ESPN middleweight champion tournament, which at the time was a big statement. Brandon Adams, as we know, went on to do great things. Just obviously beat the Ukrainian fighter that was in fucking Fight of the Year against Virgil Ortiz. So Brandon Adams is no fucking pushover at all. But of course, people that want to discredit Golovkin ignore the Kopalenko win against an undefeated Ukrainian fighter, ignore Brandon Adams in the ESPN Boxino middleweight tournament, and then after that fought Brian Vera, another very solid fighter, beat him, and then faced Golovkin, got stopped in 6 rounds. After that, went on to beat Gabriel Rosado, lost to Billy Joe Saunders for his WBO middleweight title, but obviously, went the distance with Billy Joe Saunders, ended up going on, beating Hugo Centeno Jr. in his last fight, which is a very solid win, and hasn't fought since 2019. But you didn't see anyone dominating and destroying him, except it was Golovkin. Then he faced, obviously, David Lemieux for the IBF, the IBO, the WBC interim title, and at that time, obviously, he'd already had the WBA title. David Lemieux, who was one of the most destructive fighters in boxing, and a champion that literally stepped up to take on the fight, right? We look at Lemieux's early career when he was beating these guys like Hector Camacho Jr., Elvin Ayala, really knocking motherfuckers out, faced Rubio, who at the time was 49-5-1, ended up getting stopped by Rubio, faced Joaquim Alcine, ended up losing majority decision. jumped back in there, started getting some big wins again, pushed himself up, beat Fernando Guerrero, stopped him impressively, beat Gabriel Rosado, stopping him, beat Hassam Endom in what was a very good fight, knocking Endom down multiple times, and then faced Golovkin, who dominated him easily, right? Literally making Lemieux quit. Then faced Glenn Tapia, a solid win. Faced Curtis Stevenson, stopped him in a great fight. And then faced Billy Joe Saunders, who had probably the best fight of his career. Billy Joe Saunders literally gets more credit for beating David Lemieux than Golovkin got, right? That's the irony. Faced Kareem Akor, beat him, beat Gary Spike O'Sullivan, stopped him in 1 round, beat Martin Burzak by split decision, Fancy Nentu, stopped him in 5, and then, of course, went all the way up to 168 pounds to face David Benavidez, getting stopped in 3 rounds, and then retiring afterwards. His father had been murdered, and obviously all kinds of other drama had popped up in his life, right? Then he faced undefeated American Dominic Wade, who unfortunately ended up going to jail after Golovkin, which is why you see there's a 3-year gap in his career. After getting beat by Golovkin, he ended up coming back 3 years later, had 2 fights, and I'm not sure why he didn't continue fighting afterwards. I don't know if he's back in the joint or other problems ended up surfacing once again, but obviously personal issues brought on by himself really sort of derailed his career. Prior to that, he beat ex-Australian middleweight champion Sam Solomon, another middleweight champion who had previously ducked Golovkin. So because of that, he ended up earning his mandatory fight with Golovkin, who stopped him in 2 rounds, impressively destroying him. Then he faced Kell Brook. And at this time, Golovkin was getting way too much hate, right? Even though all he was doing was everything he wanted to do, knocking out everyone standing in front of him, but yet all the big name fighters literally were ducking him. At this point, obviously Canelo Alvarez had already dropped his title in the garbage can, blatantly ducking Golovkin back in 2016, right? Basically trying to age Golovkin out at this time. Because at this time, Golovkin looked like a monster. And if you ask Vegas and all the pundits, the majority of them at that time were predicting that Golovkin would stop Canelo Alvarez at that time if they'd faced each other. I ain't lying. That's literally what people were saying. That's what the bookies, that's what people were saying in the sport of boxing. So ironic that Canelo pops up right there. He ended up facing Kell Brook, and people criticize him for facing the welterweight world champion. But this is not the first time in history where welterweight world champion met middleweight champions. Starling met Nunn, right? Was that the way it is? Armstrong met Sugar Ray. Leonard faced Hagler. Throughout boxing history, welterweights moving up to challenge middleweights has been the story between these 2 divisions. But what people fail to talk about is the fact that Kell Brook was a replacement opponent from Eddie Hearn. Eddie Hearn, who was trying to make a fight between Chris Eubank, a top middleweight contender at that time, and Golovkin, to bring Golovkin to the UK against his UK fighter. Unfortunately, after doing all the negotiation for that, Chris Eubank did what he does. He ducked and walked away from that fight. Another top fighter ducking a Golovkin fight. Kell Brook, being a man, stepped in and was the replacement. Not that Golovkin was ever trying to fight Kell Brook. He was trying to fight a middleweight. The only person pushing Kell Brook into this fight was, of course, Eddie Hearn, who didn't want to lose Golovkin date in the O2 Arena. He wanted to keep that date and keep that venue going on. So he had to find a decent, reasonable opponent. That was undefeated welterweight world champion Kell Brook. After that, he faced Danny Jacobs. This is the same Danny Jacobs who literally was the IBF world champion, right? But IBF was not on the line for this fight because Danny Jacobs didn't want to have to come in with next day weigh-ins. You can see it right here. Jacobs, who misses IBF same day weigh-in. He missed it. Why? He was the IBF champion. But yet to fight Golovkin, he missed it because he didn't want to come in with the limited bounce back weight. He wanted to balloon up and be much bigger in the Golovkin fight, which is exactly what happened. He didn't win that fight, but he was much more durable, able to take Golovkin's power a lot better, and ended up going 12 rounds with Golovkin, being the first fighter since when? Like, let's scroll back and find the last guy who literally had went the distance with Gennady Golovkin. We'll scroll back. We'll keep going. Try to find somebody who went the distance. We go all the way back to Amar Amari back in 2008. His second year as a pro, going 8 rounds. Golovkin literally had two fighters here that went 8 rounds, third guy that went 8 rounds. So he had 3 guys that went 8 rounds with him, right? And that was 2008. Danny Jacobs, he fought in 2017. Almost 10 years since his last knockout, Danny Jacobs went the distance. And literally Golovkin was criticized and shit on because he didn't knock out Danny Jacobs. And because he didn't knock out Danny Jacobs, according to many people, he lost the fight. Because this is how much hate for Golovkin was fueling at this time. This is literally where people were talking about him fighting Andre Ward, because he talked about going to the UK to fight Carl Froch. Carl Froch, who had just had a huge Wembley Stadium fight with Groves that did like 80,000 people. And he was also chasing Julio Cesar Chavez, because what Golovkin wanted was a big name opponent to help catapult him into that pay-per-view sort of level of recognition. And obviously after Sergio Martinez, Peter Quillen, Miguel Cotto, and Canelo Alvarez blatantly ducked him, those were 4 potential pay-per-views off the table. Of course, he fought Kell Brook in the UK. That was pay-per-view, but that was a UK pay-per-view. Then he faced Danny Jacobs, beat him, and then finally he ended up getting the Saul Canelo Alvarez fight. Alvarez at this time, 49-1-1, literally could have had the exact same record as Floyd Mayweather, but he ended up losing to Floyd. Ironic, right? Ended up facing Golovkin, and anyone that watched that fight believes that Golovkin was blatantly robbed in that fight. But once again, this is a European fighter fighting in Vegas, getting robbed. We saw it with Golovkin against Canelo. We saw it with Sergio Kovalev versus Andre Ward. We saw it with fucking Lomachenko versus Devin Haney. I mean, the amount of times we've seen a European blatantly robbed in Vegas is fucking ridiculous. And people say, well, Canelo's not American. What do you mean? Canelo is beloved in fucking Vegas. So please stop. We know that because he's fighting in Vegas constantly. And in his last fight, he just said Vegas is his fucking second home. So that tells you everything you need to know. After that, Canelo Alvarez failed a drug test. So Jaime Munguia was supposed to be put in as a replacement opponent. Why? Because Golden Boy was the promoter pushing this event. They had lost the fight because their fighter was not able to fight, but they didn't want to lose the venue and the date. So they still wanted to have Golovkin in a big pay-per-view fight, but they needed a reasonable opponent. So they tried to put Jaime Munguia, their young up-and-coming Mexican fighter, in. But the people in charge of Vegas wouldn't allow that because Munguia was kind of a unknown commodity at that time, even though he obviously went on to become a 154-pound champion shortly afterwards. So he ended up facing top contender Vanis Martirosyan, who Golovkin destroyed in 2 rounds. This is a Vanis Martirosyan who'd never been stopped in his career. The only guy to stop him was Golovkin. He's taller than Golovkin, same reach as Golovkin, retired after Golovkin. Literally, his last fight was against Erislandy Lara 2 years earlier. Went the distance with Lara. Didn't get dominated, didn't get destroyed. Fought Ishe Smith, beat him. Fought Charlo, went the distance with him in a very competitive fight. Didn't get destroyed by him. Beat Willie Nelson. Beat Mario Lozano. Fought Dimitri Andrade, lost a split decision very close competitive fight. Lost Lara by technical draw, right? Beat Saul Roman, right? This was a guy, beat Kasim Uma, a guy that was a very, very good fighter. But of course, people say, well, he's been inactive for 2 years, so it doesn't count, as if somehow this is a reflection of Golovkin. Golovkin is not the guy that failed the drug test. Golovkin is not the guy who picked Martirosyan. Martirosyan was picked by Golden Boy, who wanted to keep the date moving forward. So they picked Martirosyan, a Martirosyan who had been very good in his last performance against a very difficult fighter in Erislandy Lara. The same Erislandy Lara that people said Golovkin spent his whole career ducking. He ducked a guy that was a 154-pound fighter. Explain that to me. I don't get it. But this is the kind of rhetoric that was consistently pushed. Why? Well, because Golovkin is a non-black, non-American fighter who is dominating boxing. And unfortunately, we see consistently whenever you check these boxes, there's going to be a certain amount of people in America that are going to try to discredit you, hate on you, and downplay you, and try to criticize you and hold you to criticisms that they wouldn't hold other fighters to. Example, Deontay Wilder, who wasn't doing even what Golovkin was doing. Golovkin became a unified middleweight champion 2 times. Deontay Wilder never fought for unification and never was able to become a 2-time heavyweight champion. But yet people want you to believe that somehow he is more destined to become a Hall of Famer than Golovkin because he had 10 title defenses. Whereas how many title defenses did Gennady Golovkin have? People still say he had the most world championship defenses in middleweight history. Obviously, there's an asterisk beside that because it was the WBA regular title, not the WBA super title. But to be fair, the same title that Bernard Hopkins was fighting for was that WBA regular title because there was no WBA super title. So make sure you mention that when you talk about that. So in truth, Golovkin was defending the exact same belt B-Hop was defending, the exact same belt. So then we move forward to check out what he did after that. Obviously, he ended up getting the Canelo Alvarez rematch, ended up losing majority decision in this fight. A very competitive fight. Canelo, to his credit, came out and fought a real different kind of fight. Sort of was the bully, really pressuring and pushing Golovkin in this fight. And while most people don't think Canelo won the fight, people do think it was legitimately a draw. So, if you think about Golovkin against Hall of Famers, world top contenders, in truth, he should have 1 win, 1 draw, 1 loss. But of course, we know how that unfolded. Ended up then facing Stephen Rolls, undefeated Canadian fighter, stopped him in 4, faced Zurve Derevchenko in a very good fight. People felt that Golovkin really underperformed in that fight. And at this time, let's be real. Golovkin had already been a champion for 16 years, right? 16? 13. Became a champion in 2006. It was now 2019. So 13 years he'd been a world professional fighter, obviously a long amateur pedigree. So he was obviously getting older in his career, not as motivated anymore after obviously the second Canelo Alvarez fight. Faced Jamaica, undefeated fighter, stopped him in 7, ended up facing Ryota Murata in what was a great fight. A great fight, right? Ended up becoming a unified middleweight champion once again by beating Ryota Murata, right? Retired a unified middleweight champion. Moved up to face Canelo for the trilogy fight at 168 pounds and was very disappointing in this fight. I know the scorecards were competitive. Golovkin obviously always had a great jab, even though at this point he didn't look like he was able to pull the trigger on his big right hands or his lefts to the body. And at this point, 2022, right? 13, 14, 15, 16 years into his career, he's retired. 16-year career, 2-time middleweight champion, facing how many world champions? Murata, Alvarez, Jacobs, Brook, Lemieux, Daniel Giel. So 6 world champions in his career. You know, oh, sorry, 7. Kasim Uma. Was he a regular champion? Kasim Uma might have been WBA regular champion. So I will say 6. If Uma was a legitimate champion, you can correct me in my comment section. So it might be as much as 7. And obviously some guys that were really top contenders their whole career. Rosado, guys like Rubio, Martin Murray, very underrated fighter. Obviously guys like Vanis Martirosyan, who easily could have been a world champion. People felt he was robbed in the first Lara fight. And Sergio Derevchenko, who people felt should have been a champion right there, right? So that's an extra 5 potential guys that easily could have been world champions as well. But I'm not trying to create narratives. I mean, I'm just pointing it out. These are the facts. 6 world champions, 5 or 6 guys that were legitimate top-rated contenders. And then 10 world champions that we've listed tonight that blatantly ducked Gennady Golovkin, right? If you don't want to talk about Chavez and Carl Froch as well, and that would go to like potentially 12. You know, the amount of people that could have been on his resume. Andy Lee should have been on his resume, but obviously that fight, which was signed, sealed, and delivered, was going to happen in Kazakhstan, fell through because Gennady Golovkin's father died. And because of that, the fight was canceled. You know, obviously Pirog, you know, was a world champion, should have been on his resume as well. But we know that being the debut in America, Pirog obviously injured his back and retired from the sport of boxing. You know, sometimes things just don't work out for you. A great example of this is a guy like Aaron Pryor. Aaron Pryor is seen as one of the best fighters in boxing. Yet if you go back and look at his resume, it's very mediocre. Outside of a guy that came up several weight divisions to face him, you know, there's not a lot of quality on his resume, right? And obviously the big fights fell through his fingers. You look at a guy like Charlie Burley, right? Charlie Burley is considered one of the best fighters in boxing history. Yet Charlie Burley was never a world champion. And Sugar Ray Robinson blatantly ducked him for years, right? Because unfortunately, this is the way things go. Sometimes opportunities just don't land in your pocket. And when they do, you get fucking railroaded and screwed. If he would have beat Canelo Alvarez here, what would have probably happened in the next fight, especially if Canelo would have failed his drug test, he probably would have faced Billy Joe Saunders to become undisputed. Him becoming an undisputed middleweight champion at that time, beating Billy Joe Saunders to do that, would have then just elevated that Canelo Alvarez rematch to a whole nother level. At this point, other potential fights like Eubank and other fighters like Carl Froch or George Groves or Julio Cesar Chavez Jr., these fights may have materialized even more so. Maybe the guys from 154 pounds would have grew the balls to actually come up and legitimately challenge Golovkin, right? Because the money would have been worthwhile. So unfortunately, circumstances didn't work out perfectly. Sometimes that's what happens. Sometimes it's not a storybook ending. You know, it's not a perfect fairy tale. You don't win an Olympic gold medal. People thought he was going to, ended up losing, won the silver, signed with a promoter that thought, you know, Felix Sturm's promoter, perfect. I'm going to become middleweight champion, face Felix Sturm, and then face fucking my man. Who did I mention earlier? Why I can't think of his name? You know, tough American. Lost to B-Hop. What? His name fucking just escapes me. But like fights like that could have easily happened earlier in his career, which would have really cemented Golovkin as one of the best fighters in boxing far earlier than when he made his first approach to the American audience. But unfortunately, a lot of Americans are just kind of ignorant. They think the world revolves around them, so they don't really pay attention to fighters until they really come to America. We saw that, of course, with Inouye. We saw it with Roman Gonzalez. We saw it with a lot of British fighters back in the day. right? And unfortunately, it still holds true in a lot of ways. But let me know in the comment section below. Uh, what did you think about Golovkin? Were you a fan? If not, why? And if so, why? For me, I thought Golovkin was a super exciting fighter. Great cutting off the ring, great body shots, great power, had a really great jab. One of the best jabs in boxing. Landed at the highest percentage in the sport of boxing, even until his last fight with Canelo Alvarez. That was the one punch that remained with him, right? And the fight that carried him through fights with Derevchenko and Murata. But it is what it is. Let me know what you think in the comment section below. Thanks for watching, and I will see you next time. Remember to like, subscribe, and share.